H2kinfosys provides world-class online IT training, staffing and software testing solutions to customers worldwide. H2kinfosys supports 100% job-oriented training, hands-on project work, cloud test lab, resume preparation and review, mock interviews, robust syllabus. One-time pay, lifetime access to live classes and videos. H2kinfosys has won the trust of thousands of students worldwide. For free demo class, visit H2kinfosys.com.
Welcome to another video of H2kinfosys. So in this video we are going to see the concept of the for loop. Out here is another type of loop statement. So in the last session we have seen the usage of the while loop, and in the while loop is specifically used when we actually do not know how many loops will be required to throw the perfect result for a particular problem given to us. So if we know that these are the number of loops that we need to throw out the result, we will definitely go for a for loop instead of a while loop. The next behavior of the for loop is that the for loop rarely throws out an infinite result, which we have seen that it frequently happens in while loop. So if in while loop we are getting infinite result, that is because of the fact that the condition becomes true. So until unless the condition remains true, the loop will keep on happening, and the statements which are present inside the body of the while loop will keep on getting executed. So in that particular manner, while loop is disadvantage or a disadvantage loop statement in comparison to for loop. In for loop, this particular aspect is not there. That is the aspect of having an infinite looping, because generally in for loop we describe the condition in such a manner that we avoid using the infinite loop structure. Uh, Now, what is for loop? Let us see that in some time. Now, when we want to execute a sequence of events or statements, rather, I would say, or a sequence of codes multiple times and abbreviate the code that manages a loop variable, we use the for loop out here. So what is a for loop? It's a repetition control structure. It's a control structure by itself by which we can control the loops. Okay, so it's a repetition control structure that allows us to efficiently write a loop that needs to be executed a specific number of times. So as I have told you earlier also, a for loop will be used under the circumstances that we know that this is the number of times the looping should happen. Okay, and we are sure about the number of times that the looping should happen. So if we are sanguine about this particular fact, then we use a for loop. Otherwise, we'll use a while loop. We generally try to avoid the while loop because while loop has a tendency to go for an infinite loop because of the conditions that are defined. So if the condition remains true, the looping will keep on happening. Okay. So this is the typical, diagram of a flow chart of a for loop. So the diagram specifies this particular part. So in the for loop, we have an initial statement. Okay, the initial statement is nothing but a variable value, and that variable value will be checked with the condition. Now, if the condition is true, then the coding block within the body of the for loop will get executed, and probably there the incrementation of the variable that is being initialized, and after incrementation again the condition is checked, and if the condition is true, then again the coding block, that is the block of codes written within the body of the for loop, will get executed. Again there will be incrementation. At any point of time, if the condition becomes false, the compiler is going to terminate the for loop. So in the initial for loop, that means for the first loop to happen in the for loop statement, the initial value of the variable will be checked with the condition. And then what is going to happen? The code block or the block of code written within the body of the for loop will get executed. Now for the second loop and further loops to happen, or rather from the second loops and onwards, what is going to happen in for loop is that first the incrementation or the decrementation of the variable that has been initialized will happen. So after decrementation of the variable or the incrementation of the variable, the condition will be checked. If the condition becomes false, the second loop and onwards will not happen and the compiler will terminate the for loop. And after incrementation or decrementation, if the condition remains true, then again the body or the block of codes written within the body of the for loop will get executed. Now, if we compare it with the while loop, in while loop, what happens is that we check the condition is true, the block of code will be executed, and again the condition is checked after the incrementation or decrementation of the initial value of the variable. Now, if the condition remains true, the body part of the while loop will keep on getting executed, and that is what is the condition of a infinite looping. Okay, so in similar fashion, in if you take about the for loop concept, in for loop concept, the first looping happens by looking at the initial value, that is the init block, and the condition block, which is nothing but a decision making statement. Okay, the condition block, if remains true, will be helping us to execute the block of code written within between the body of the for loop. If the condition becomes false, the first looping will not happen and the compiler will terminate or get out of the for loop. If the condition is true, obviously the block of code will be executed, and if an incremental or a decremental statement is written within the block of code, that will happen, and again after incrementation of the value the condition is going to be checked. So for second loop and onwards, the incremented or the decremented value which might be part of the block of code will be checked through the condition, and if the condition is true, then only again the repetition of the block of code will happen. If the condition becomes false, the repetition of the block of code will not happen, and there will be no second loop or third loop, whatever it is. This is how the for loop differs from the while loop. Generally, we use the for loop when we know that this is the number of times we are going to have loops. If we are not sure about the number of loops that we want, then we go for a while loop. And in conditions where you are using the while loop or in condition in which you are using the for loop, the main aspect is the condition statement. It is based on the condition statement that we get a finite loop or an infinite loop in the while loop statement or in the for loop statement. But generally, for loop is safer than while loop because for loop very rarely throws out an infinite loop, whereas while loop is a frequent what do you call a condition in which the concept of infinite looping will come into existence. Going forward with the for loop, so as we have discussed, a for loop is useful when we know how many times a task is to be repeated. That means a block of code needs to be repeated. That's what we have discussed earlier also. Now next is what does a for loop contain? So what is the argument of a for loop, or rather what are the arguments of the for loop? The first argument is the initial statement. The second argument is the conditional statement. The third argument is the increment or a decrement statement. Okay, now for the first loop to happen, the initial statement will be checked with the condition. If the condition is true, then the first loop will happen. If the condition is false, the first loop will not happen. For the second loop to happen, or for the third loop to happen, or rather from second looping onwards, what is going to happen is that first the increment or the decrement statement will come into force. After the particular variable's value is incremented or decremented, the conditional statement is checked. If the condition is true, then the second looping and onwards, that means onward loopings will happen. If the condition becomes false, the second looping or onward looping will not happen. This is how the for loop works. And this process is not prevalent in while loops. In while loops, you have an initial statement. The initial statement is checked with the condition. Condition is true. The block of codes written within the body of the while loop will get executed. If the condition is false, the block of code will not get executed. Okay, and until unless the condition remains true, the block of code will keep on repeating itself in the while loop. Now, the condition statement that we use in the for loop, which is nothing but the second argument of a for loop, will use comparative operators, and comparative operators, as we have seen earlier, do use, the concept of your Boolean results. The comparison throws you Boolean result, and if the Boolean result is true, we know that the loopings will happen. If the Boolean result is false, the compiler will terminate the for loop. Now, what we have discussed is what I have described it out here. First looping will be dependent on initial statement and conditional statement. If the condition is true, first looping will happen, else it gets out of the for loop. Second looping and further. First, we will increment the value of the variable, okay, and or decrement it, whatever it is. Then check up the condition. If the condition is true, second looping and further loops will happen, else we get out of the for loop. This is the structure or the working behavior of the for loop out here. And in the conditional statement, we might have the concept of your AND logic or OR logic use. And this is the AND logic or the OR logic table out here. The AND logic says that if the both the conditions are true, if both the inputs are true, the output is true. Otherwise, output is false. The OR logic says that if one of the conditions is true or one of the input conditions are true, the output will be true for our OR logic. So how to use for loop? So this is specifically a simple syntax of a for loop. The for loop is followed by a parenthesis, and parenthesis is followed by a opening curly brace and a closing curly brace. And this opening curly brace is the closing curly brace is the body. The body of the for loop is written within the opening curly brace and the closing curly brace. And within the parenthesis of the for loop, we will have three arguments: the initial statement, which is followed by a semicolon, followed by a conditional statement, followed by a semicolon, and the third argument is your incrementation or decrementation statement, which will be followed by a closure of the parenthesis. The closing parenthesis is given. Now, as we have discussed, the first looping will happen where the initial statement will be checked with the condition. If the condition is true, the body part of the for loop will get executed for the first time. If the condition is false, the compiler will terminate the for loop. Okay. For second looping and onwards, the first thing that is going to happen is incrementation and decrementation. The incremented value or the decremented value will be checked with the condition. If the condition is true, the body part of the for loop will get executed. Otherwise, if the condition is false, the body part of the for loop will not executed. That compiler will terminate the for loop. Now let us see an example of the for loop in Eclipse. So I already have the Eclipse open. So I'll create a new project called as session 11. Click on next button and click on finish and say no to the perspective. I don't want to change the perspective or the theme of Eclipse IDE. So inside this particular project, I will create a new package called as for loop package. And inside this package, I'm going to create a new class file called as for loop. And call up the main method because I want to execute the codes and the code result should be thrown in the console of Eclipse.